Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we do part 2 of the New World. In this section, we do slavery, economics, and racism in the New World. So when we left off, the Europeans had a problem. They had all this sugar they were going to make a whole lot of money off of, but they needed workers to do that. The problem was the Native Americans, through both violence, genocide, but also mostly through the diseases of the old world, had died at a 95% extinction level. The solution to that problem was African slavery to replace the native labor. Why? Well, because to the Europeans, it was the only option. The European peasants didn't want to be workers in America. The sugar was too hard. It was too hot. If you got yellow fever or malaria, you died. They'd much rather stay in France, in Spain, in England. So you couldn't get workers from America. They weren't going to go and be a laborer in someone's plantation, where they were a farmer on their own land in Europe. That wasn't going to happen. That's a step down for European peasants. And let's face it, their lords weren't going to let them go anyway. So it wasn't like you could go to your local lord and say, hey, I want to go be a worker on a plantation in America. They weren't going to let you go. They needed the laborer in France. 2, Ming China, Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire, the African kingdoms of the East Coast and the Sahel, they're way too strong to plunder. The Portuguese, and to a lesser extent the Spanish, try. They show up in these places and say, we're going to take people as slaves. Doesn't work. The Ming dynasty sent a navy and kicked the Portuguese out of China. You just couldn't show up in these places, including Africa, including Sahel Africa and the East Coast of Africa, and take people as slaves. Third, you couldn't enslave fellow Christians. From Theodosius in 390 on, and this goes back to the Hebrew rules, is you cannot enslave a fellow Christian. All Christians are equal before God. So this is why slavery died in Europe. It had existed in the Roman era, but when Theodosius makes everyone a Christian, slavery ends because you couldn't own another Christian as a slave. You're all equal. So Africans were not Christian. 3, it was hot. It's hot in the Caribbean. It's hot in Africa. What's the difference where you work? Like, this was literally a justification for Europeans being like, we could take Africans. It's hot here in Africa. It's hot there in the Caribbean. What difference does it make? And lastly, and most importantly, slavery already existed in Africa. Africa is big, very big as a continent. The maps that you look at are not real. They overemphasize the northern and southern latitudes and de-emphasize the middle. Africa is way bigger than Europe. It's a very big continent, but it didn't have a lot of people in it. And so warfare, for as long as warfare is going on in Africa, was not for control of land. It was for control of people. Because you could own 1 million acres of land in Africa. It didn't matter if you didn't have anyone to work it. And so there's a long history of warfare in order to capture people to be slaves, to be workers. The Romans had the same kind of system. The Romans turned all Carthaginians into slaves at the end of the Third Punic War. 50,000 people were turned into slaves. They were all put onto these plantations, all put into the mines, where they became assimilated into the larger Roman Empire, and they disappear. Some will become citizens. As time goes on, more and more will become freedmen, but they'll become Romans. They'll stop being Carthaginians. And so there's an infrastructure in coastal African kingdoms for slaves. And part of this goes back to the Portuguese factory towns, the trade ports. The coastal African kingdoms on the East Coast and the West Coast had trade links that allowed them to have an economic advantage. They turned that economic advantage into a military advantage, and they would go into the interior of Africa, of the East Coast and the West Coast, capture people, and use them for labor. On the East Coast, this goes back to the 900s, 1000 maybe, AD. The East Coast of Africa, all the way down to Mozambique, Zanzibar, sold slaves to the Middle Eastern world, to the Arabian world. And it was coastal African kingdoms going into the interior, capturing either polytheistic or Christians, depending on if you're in the southern part of Eastern Africa or the northern part. The northern part had Christians along the Nile. If you're a Muslim, you could capture Christians and sell them into slavery. And so there's an infrastructure in both western coast of Africa and eastern coast of Africa for capturing slaves, moving them from the interior to the coast, and then moving them along, selling them along. So what's the problem? There are several problems with this system. Before we even get into the problem of slavery, there's problems with the concept of the system. First is the Catholic Church is powerful and wants to convert people. And the Africans aren't Christians. They're not Muslims. They haven't rejected Jesus. The argument very, very early on is they have to be introduced to Jesus. If they reject Jesus, then they can be slaves. But they have to be given a chance. And if we convert them to Christians, they can't be slaves. Two, coastal Africans had slavery, and they had an infrastructure for moving slaves along, for either using their labor or selling them along, but they had no infrastructure for the massive slave trade that the Europeans were going to need. Remember, the Europeans are going to have to replace 50 million people of Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean. You know, that much labor force that they're going to want to replace, the coastal Africans don't have that. I mean, that's just beyond. So the insatiable demand that the Europeans, that sugar will demand, that the mines will demand, this insatiable, we need more workers constantly. That, for all that slavery exists in Africa, this wasn't built. This wasn't there. They're going to need weapons, need ports, need roads. They're going to need lots and lots of money to build this infrastructure, to move tens of millions of people from the interior to the coast and then ship them across the Atlantic. So when I say slavery existed in Africa, we're still talking on the thousands, tens of thousands of level. It's a lot, but it's nothing compared to what the Europeans are going to demand. Or even what the Arabs demanded. The Arabs will take less people out of Africa in roughly 800 years, 800 years. Will take less people in 800 years than Europeans will take in 300 years. And third, the interior Africans, the people who will be turned into slaves, one, are not happy to be slaves. So they'll revolt, they'll run. There requires violence to capture them, to keep them, to hold them, to maintain them, to force them to move, to force them to work. The entire system is based upon constant resistance, constant violence. There are no happy slaves. There are no nice slave masters or owners. There are none, because there is constant resistance and constant violence, terror. Two, a third of the people are going to die on the trip across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, as it's called. Because the beginning passage is from the interior to the coast, then the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, and then the end from when you're sold on the dock or the slave port to wherever you need to go. A third of people will die on the Middle Passage. Now, why do they die? Well, first of all, disease. You're taking a lot of people from the interior of Africa who did not hang out together, who did not associate with each other, did not live with each other, and now you're crowding them into a small place. So if one has a cold, one has the flu, it's going to spread. Second, the shipping, the slave, everyone wants to make the most amount of money as quickly as possible. So what you do is you fill the ship up with as many people as you can physically store in them. Shipping is expensive. And so if you're going to make one trip a year from Africa to Brazil, you're going to load up your ship as full of people as possible. So again, the health of the people is not important to you. So what is this? This is a loss of investment. If a third of your product dies, that's bad. So they crowd people in knowing they're going to lose 30%. It's called, in economics, it's called wastage. I know we're talking about people, but this is very important because in economics, you have a wastage category. Even though you're talking about people, you don't refer to them as people. This is what capitalism does. And you can see we're starting to create capitalism. We are not quite there, but we're starting. The slave trade is one of the big motivating factors. The sugar slave trade is one of the big motivating factors for the creation of capitalism. So that loss of investment is going to force us to have insurance. So insurance companies are going to insure the amount of people who die along the way. So if you get more than a third, you get more than 2/3. If less than a third of people die, you made money. Great. If more than a third die, it's okay. They're covered by insurance. You're going to get paid anyway. So because of so what would have happened if there was no insurance companies? If what there was no capitalistic corporate structure, you would never have had the money to have paid the coastal Africans for the amount of people that you're going to need to ship. Without the insurance, the Middle Passage would have either been completely unprofitable to do, because you're paying the coastal Africans for people who you cannot sell, who you have to throw off the ship as shark food. But so they're a loss. Or you had to make sure that these people would survive. That instead of 66% survive, you would have had to make it 90% survive. Maybe more. You would have had to have taken less people at less speed in better conditions. Which means the entire system would have again broken down. The slave trade works because of the capitalist infrastructure of corporations, of stock, of insurance, especially insurance, that allows these companies, allows these investors to make the profit on the end product, which is sugar. Without capitalist and capitalism inventions, financial inventions, corporate inventions, this system could not have worked. Because you could have no one had the money for the scale that was required. 3, the work was so hard. There was so much disease, especially from yellow fever and malaria, that slaves average a 3-year lifespan in America, which means there's a constant need for more people. The Europeans constantly are demanding more. Sugar keeps selling at ever larger amounts. The sugar planters need more labor because their workers are dying, which means the shipping and the slavery markets are going to Africa and demanding more and demanding more and demanding more. Which means the infrastructure is being built to handle more and more and more people at higher rates. Doesn't anyone feel bad about this? Doesn't anybody hate this system? The answer is yes. We already talked about the Catholic Church. Yes. And there's actually a debate. There's actually a moment, and this is one of the most amazing things that have ever happened in history. There's actually a place and a time when people sat down, got in a group, officially had a sit down, and discussed, should slavery exist? Should we do what the system is starting to do? Should we stop it? There is actually a debate. Should we not have slavery? Should we not have racism? Should we not murder the Indians and the Native Americans and the indigenous peoples? Should we not do these things? There's actually a sit down where the brightest minds, the most important people sat down. The king, his lords, the church, important people, important philosophers sat down and said, should we do what we're doing, or should we stop it before it's too late? And that's the Valladolid debate for where it took place. There's, should slavery exist in the New World? And essentially, well, lots of people talked. It comes down to two voices. There's Las Casas, Bartolomeo Las Casas, who is the proponent for human rights. The hashtag all souls matter. All souls are equal. His argument is we shouldn't do this. Now, we have to be fair to the Las Casas haters. Las Casas was for protecting the natives very early on. He's one of the first voices that's like the violence. Remember we talked about turning natives into peasants and stealing their gold and destroying them? He is one of the first people to go around the New World and chart and write diaries about all of the violence being portrayed on these people and saying this shouldn't work. He is one of the first human rights advocates in the modern world. And his argument is all people are equal before God. Basically, these are people, thus human rights. Now, he does sell out the Africans to protect the natives. Because his argument originally is we have to protect the natives. They have a right to become Christians. We have to stop all this violence. And the lords of the New World, the conquistadors and lords, and even the king who's making money says, well, what should we do? We need people to work. We need miners in the mines. What should we do? And his argument was, use Africans. They're heathens. They're not Christians. Use them. Now, he'll regret that. He will deny that. Once he sees what happens with the new slave trade, because he basically got what he wanted. The natives will be, in some ways, in the Spanish world, protected by the church. And then the Africans will show up. And he will see that they don't treat the Africans better. If anything, they treat the Africans worse. And so he will regret that. He will renunciate it. He'll say, yes, I did this, but I am sorry and I was wrong. Because ultimately, his argument is Jesus is watching us. And everything in the New Testament says slavery is wrong. Jesus is watching. Now, the guy who is most famous for taking the opposite view, or not quite the opposite view, but the opposing view, is Septuagint, De Septuagint, who says, he's another priest, he says, all of that is true. All souls are equal. We should love human rights. Jesus is watching. Yes, it is all true. He agrees on every point in Las Casas. The king is sitting there. The lords are sitting there. And then he goes, but. I go, I agree with everything Las Casas says. They should be given the chance to become Christians. If they become Christians, they should be protected. I totally agree with all of that. But. There's a but. And the but is the king gets 20% gross off the top. He basically pulls out a whole lot of money, takes the wrapping off of it, takes the blanket off of it, and says, you get 20%, king. And the king looks at that money, that sugar money, that plundered Aztec gold, and he's got problems. Not with his soul, but he's got the Inquisition to fight. He's got a war with France to fight. He's got a civil war in Germany because of the Reformation to fight. And the sugar money is an ocean of cash. It is unending. It is an ocean of cash. And the silver, which may be worth more because you could directly pump it right back into the veins of the war effort, is a literal mountain in Bolivia. Potosi, P-O-T-O-S-I. Potosi. P-O-T-O-S-I. It's a literal mountain in Bolivia. The Potosi mountain was basically a mountain literally made out of silver. If you dug into it, you found silver. And so the king looks at that and says, yeah, we're going to keep the system. We're going to expand the system. I want my 20%. It's just, yes. And this is, as a historian, one of the most disheartening things I have to teach. It is a thing I don't want to talk about. Because there's a moment where the modern world as we know it doesn't have to exist. We are still living with the consequences of slavery in America, in Latin America, in South America. We are still living with this, with the racism, with the violence, with the plunder. Everything that comes after Valladolid is made of the modern world from that moment. That it's okay to enslave these people. And it didn't have to be that way. That Las Casas is arguing for morality, and he lost out to capitalism, which is amoral. Capitalism is not immoral, it's amoral. Capitalism simply doesn't care about ethics and morality. Adam Smith will tell us this. Adam Smith is a moral philosopher. He's not an economist. When he writes The Wealth of Nations, he's talking about how people should act, how nations should act. He's not an economist. There are no economists. He's writing about people and their activities and their actions and how to live a good life. Morality will lose to capitalism. And we are going to talk about that problem over and over and over again for the rest of this class. The problem capitalism has with morality, that ultimately people like the money capitalism makes, but they don't like the morality or amorality of capitalism. So what's the solution then? The church still wants its souls. Black people, Africans should still be able to meet Jesus and get into heaven. Right? Okay, if we're going to keep slavery and the rule is Christians can't be slaves, what's the solution? which is basically Las Casas' throwdown. Like, fine, you want to keep the system? Great. Solve this problem. All Christians are equal before God. The Africans should be Christians. And the king agrees with that. The king agrees. The Catholic Church wants it. The king of Spain by this point, needs the Catholic Church's support. So he goes, yes, the slaves should become Christian. Yes. But that means they're equal. That means they can't be slaves. And yet, for you to get your 20%, they have to be slaves, which means they can't be Christians. But everybody agrees they have to be Christians. So what is the answer? The answer is the invention of one of the worst things humans have ever philosophically come up with to justify their selfishness. And that is racism. What racism does is change your human value to the color of your skin. Now, what does that mean? That does not mean people liked each other before, but they saw each other through culture. You were a Greek or you weren't. You were a Jew or you weren't. You were a Roman citizen or you weren't. You were a Christian or you weren't. You were from this region of France or you weren't. There was always insiders and outsiders. There were always foreigners, and that foreigner might be a person from the next town, the next region. It didn't have to be far. So people always broke down to an us versus them. But they didn't do it on skin color. You could be black and become Greek. You could be Middle Eastern, Persian, Indian, and become Greek. You picked up Greek culture. You picked up Greek language. It may not have been easy, but you could. The Roman concept of natio, N-I-T-I-O, absorbs everybody, no matter what their color. We don't have a lot of references in Roman literature to the color of people. It's exotic. Oh, this is an Ethiopian. That tells you they're a black person. But if they're a Roman citizen, and every Roman general would hire Nubian light cavalry, you would not go into battle without them. That was just dumb. They were the best light horse archer scouts in the world. And they were black and Berber Africans, black and brown Africans. Nobody thought that was weird. They said, of course you need these people. So what racism does is reduce your human value to skin color. What racism allows was the Catholic Church to convert Africans to Jesus, but also say they will never be equal to Europeans. And this is a totally new idea for the reasons I just explained. This is totally a new philosophical concept. That you can be Christian and be a slave. That you could be Christian and not equal. This is new. So what does racism do? Weirdly, it invents whiteness. It invents the concept of whiteness. Because ultimately now a white person, I should explain, ultimately a white person is a Christian and maybe Jewish at times, depending on where you're from. Maybe. Because there's plenty of anti-Semitism all throughout Europe, and Jewish people are not considered Europeans, and then sometimes they are, and then sometimes they're not. But to be white, you're ultimately a Christian of European descent. That's what you have to be white. No, that doesn't mean white people accepted all other people as white people, especially in Europe. No, they're going to see each other as different. But in the New World, your whiteness was defined by not being black. You were not a slave. You were not an African. And thus, you were white. 2, it invents color as the test measure to all morality. The blacker your skin is, the worse you are at all things. Second, or B, part B of this is the unchanging skin color. The fact that your skin cannot change became the idea that it was natural, that was God determined, which means slavery for the first time became generational. For the first time in European culture, but even in Islamic culture, became generational. Your descendants were going to be slaves, and their descendants were going to be slaves. And that is not a Roman concept. That is not an Islamic concept. Both had the concept that people should be Roman, people should be Muslim, that you, even as a slave owner, had a right to their bodies, but the next generation was different, was separate. That the slavery of one generation didn't permanently carry over to the next generation. That doesn't mean it didn't at all, but it meant there is a huge industry for manumission in both Islam and the Roman world to turn the next generation of slaves into something else, into some kind of Roman Islamic citizen. Racism meant, one, you could always identify a slave. You could always identify a foreigner. You could always identify just from far away, was this person like you or not like you? Were they of the same social status or not? And the second thing is, it was unchanging, so it was generational. And then it was seen as natural. Well, they're black. Of course they're worse than us. We're white. Of course we're better. It became natural. The third is it invents this fear of black people, of Africans that didn't exist before. Up to this point, Europeans are trading with the Africans. There's a long history of trade, of mercenary work, of interaction. Black people and white people got along perfectly fine before this moment. So, but what this creates, what racism creates, is a fear of black people because it requires white violence. Black African peoples do not want to be slaves. And so it requires white violence, control, and terror. Because they're going to resist. African peoples are going to fight back. They're going to resist in whatever manner they can. And there's always the fear, and this is the Spartan fear. It's the fear of all slave owners. It's the Spartan fear of the Helots. They want to revolt and murder us. That ultimately they resent us for the power we have over them, for the violence we have over them. And if given a chance, they will murder us. So white women have to be kept separate. They have to be, quote unquote, protected. So a lot of the laws that are going to be created involving slavery are separations of black men from white women. They must be kept separate. And there's also this secret irony to this. There's also the idea in all of these laws and all of this idea, and you can see this in the courtroom scene in To Kill a Mockingbird, is secretly white women prefer black men. That white men are inferior because they have to resort to violence. That for all the thing about racism, the thing that at the core of racism is an inferiority of the racist. That in their heart of hearts, they know they're not equal. And so we must keep white women away from black men because white women secretly prefer black men as partners. If given the chance, if given the opportunity. The second is fear of revolt. That black men are stronger, that blacks are stronger. They're more, quote unquote, animalistic. They're more animal than white people are. That civilization, and we have talked about this in 101, that civilization makes you weak. And the Africans don't live in cities. They weren't Christian. They weren't pacified. So they're more barbaric, which is good for workers, but bad if they ever revolt, that they'll overwhelm white people. So there's this fear. If you see the movie Birth of a Nation, not the original in 1915, but the one about Nat Turner's rebellion, you see movies about slave revolt. If you know Southern history at all, there is, before 1860, a obsession with slave revolts, a terror of slave revolts. And part of that is the concept that black people are simply stronger than we are. They're better at war than we are. And they'll couch that as more animal than civilized. But ultimately, it goes back to the very nature of settled people, that being settled makes you weak, fat, and lazy. And ultimately, that the slave owners, that the white class knows it in their heart of hearts. And the third is what it does to black women, to African women. It makes them magical, seductive. That the rape, the sexual assaults that are going to happen, that almost all, like the hashtag not all men, in this case, almost all men are going to participate with, is, well, if black people are inferior, then why, as a white person, are you having sex with black women? They're not equal to you. And the story becomes, they're seductive, they're sirens, they're magic, they're exotic. I can't resist them. There's something about African women they're not white. They're magical. There's something exotic. And what black women really want to do is seduce and destroy white men with this magic sexual power. And so there's this fear. It's still modern. It's still here in America. You could see pieces of it all over the place. It was illegal in the United States, in many states, for a black man and a white woman to get married until about, 1972? The year my parents got married. Like, that's not ancient history. That's my parents' time. That's grandmama's time. That it was illegal. You read To Kill a Mockingbird. The entire courtroom scene is about the possibility that a black man and a white woman might have some kind of physical relationship. You had to bring the court, you had to bring the lawyers, you had to bring evidence, you had to bring the cops, you had to bring in a jury. You had to bring in the witnesses. All of that time had to be spent because a white woman might have had a physical relationship with a black man. So we're still dealing with this 400 years later. So what are the effects? And knowing this is a 102 class and we can't do all of the effects, and you could easily do there are entire books just on this slide. The first is that there are 15 million people removed from Africa. America gets rich, white America gets rich, and Africa becomes poor. By pulling out 15 million people, mostly almost 75, 85% young men. These are men in their prime productive years. The African empires, the African kingdoms cannot expand, cannot hit the productivity for takeoff. In fact, Africa becomes economically tied to selling off its manhood. Coastal Africans who do not see themselves as Africans. They are whatever language, people group they are. They don't have a problem with this because they do not see the interior Africans as people like them. They're foreigners. Remember the culture part. They don't care. A slave's a slave. They don't care where we go. There's no morality to this. It's economic. So yes, coastal Africa will get wealthy on this. But remember, they're also selling off the people who they could have conquered and turned into slaves to work for them to make them richer. They're selling off their own future laborers. And thus, the coastal parts of Africa, while making money, are also robbing their futures without knowing it, because no one's thinking in the future, but they're robbing their future productivity gains. Meanwhile, America, North and South America, by bringing in 15 million people, those 15 million people are going to work for the American economies against their will, and they will not be paid, and they'll have tremendous violence against them, but that will make the Americas rich. The Caribbean was perhaps per capita of free labor, free people, the richest place in the world by 1750. Brazil and the Caribbean become African. The native populations die, and they are replaced by this white veneer, but really an African cultural hegemony, because 80% of the population of Brazil is African. So it has a white accent. Yeah, there's white Christianity, but it's also voodoo. The food, the songs, the drums, the beats. These places, and we celebrate this in Brazil with football, with the soccer style. That's got a little bit of mambo to it. It's got a different beat to it. It's got a different way of playing than white football, white soccer. What they did was make everything south of Florida African. And it moved Africa to America. And people kind of don't realize that, but it's true. You go to Jamaica, it's part of Africa. Now, it has a bit of Spain on it, it has a bit of Britain on it, but that's this top level. But when you come to how people eat, how they dance, even the type of Christianity they worship, that once you get past Jesus, how you worship Jesus, there's a lot of Africa in there. Much more Africa than Europe. North America, the United States, which will only take in 5% of African slaves. Right? 95% will go, 80% will go to Brazil. The other 15% will go to the Caribbean. North America takes in about 5% of African slaves. It will affect the entire economy and society. Banks, trade, shipping, insurance, housing, guns will all be developed with the idea that there are thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and ultimately millions of slaves. They are never the majority of the population. In some counties, they are the majority of the population, yes. But in any old state, in any colony, they're not the majority of the population. Not like Barbados or Jamaica or Haiti, where they are 90% of the population. They come close in South Carolina, which is why South Carolina was the first state to secede. They come close, but they are never the majority of the population, much less the massive majority. And yet, the entire system of economics, shipping, insurance, housing, where people live, will be dedicated around slaves. Whether it's the plantation or the New England, New York ghetto, of where people will be living is seen through the lens of what do you do with black people. America's toleration, the United States' toleration for high levels of violence, of personal violence, and hierarchy. That, remember, we are a democratic society, that once we throw off Britain, America, the North America, the USA becomes democratic. We're all equal. Except we're not, because there's a large number of slaves. And so that violence carries over, whether it's into Congress, whether it's into the law, whether it's into how people deal with each other. You go out west to the Wild West. Those people are committing violence to each other because they could commit violence back east. The Canadians don't do that. The Mexicans don't do that in their frontier lands. The Americans do. The Second Amendment because everyone knows the gun part, but remember the militia part. The Second Amendment was written into the Constitution to protect states from Poor People's Rebellion, like Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and slave revolts in the South. White people are able to own guns because poor white farmers, and slaves might revolt. And so citizens, the middle class, and the rich people had to have access to guns to protect themselves and, more importantly, the state, which protected them from these rebellions. That's why it was personal protection, yes, from black people, from poor people. Not from other white people, not from crime, but from rebellion. So guns, the Second Amendment is a racist amendment. It always was, because it was always about allowing a group of people to have access to weapons that you used either against the poor, the slaved, or if you headed west, the Indian, the Native American. Europe gets rich. Everything we're going to talk about is funded in some way, shape, or form off the money for the next 500 years, off the money of trade with the New World. The resources of the New World are going to be plundered, forests cut down, mines extracted, minerals dug out of the earth. Europe is going to get rich because you're no longer Britain or France anymore. You're an empire. And you could pull resources from all over the world. Whereas China is China. And China's big. China's a continent. And India's in India. And it's a continent. It's a subcontinent. It's huge. But there were limits to India and there's limits to China. There's no limits anymore. Spain owned all of South America except for Brazil, which had a lot of jungle, all of Central America and all of Mexico, and up until Canada, up until Oregon. It could pull resources from a territory that was simply dwarfed what Britain, France, Spain, or Portugal could pull from in its own territory. Wars are going to be fought for control of the slave trade. It makes so much money. The British will ultimately win. The British will be the biggest. It starts with the Spanish, but ultimately it's the British. The British are the biggest slave exporters of them all. The British will ultimately stop the slave trade too in the 1830s. And they will send their navy to stop the slave trade, to stop private companies. They will say, they will put a blanket, no more slave trade, no more African slave trade, and that's the end. And while private companies will keep doing it because it's an illicit trade, it makes even more money if you can get away with it, the British will also dedicate part of their navy to enforcing this rule. 2, discovery of the New World equaled the Bible and the ancients were wrong. There is no America in the Bible. The ancients didn't know America was there. They didn't know the plants, the animals, the world, the mountains, the rivers. There was an entire world that people understood. The discovery of New World meant what they understood was wrong. It doesn't mean the Bible is totally wrong. It meant the Bible had no concept of this stuff. And so people can question it. People question the ancients. They question Aristotle. It's a crisis of knowledge. So you may go, whoa, Professor, the Bible's still right. And then you go, okay. But let's put it this way. If you discovered humans on the moon when we went in 1969, if Neil Armstrong got off Apollo 11, turned around, and there were 4 people waving, hi, you'd have to look at your Bible differently than you did the day before. Because your Bible doesn't talk about moon people. How did they get there? Where did they come from? Remember Adam and Eve? Well, if that's true, how did they end up in America? Right? What kind of people? Wait, how did they get there? The discovery of the New World broke all of the assumptions people had about how the world worked. And it broke all the assumptions how the world worked was built upon. And so it's a crisis of knowledge. And we're going to see this in the Enlightenment, in science, in the Reformation, in our next classes. Because now people have to deal with all of this new knowledge. Animals that are never described anywhere exist. The llama. Well, wait, what? Huh? Who? What? And finally, there are new concepts of the natural man. Of the nature of man. The old hierarchy was you're a peasant. You worked as a peasant, you lived as a peasant. Like your daddy did, and your daddy's daddy did. And the Lord was the son of the Lord and the grandson of the Lord. This was an unchanging hierarchy going back 1,000 years. And so there was a naturalness, an acceptedness, this is the way things are. But now, you can go out and get rich. You can leave the farm. You could stop being a peasant and go to the New World. Whether you can find someone to pay your way, you could sell yourself into indentured servitude, or you could find your own money and go yourself. You had an entire continent that if it didn't kill you, you could get rich. And suddenly there's a break in the old hierarchy, because how do you keep people on the farm when they could go to New York? When they could go to Mexico? When they could go to Barbados, start a sugar plantation, buy a few slaves, and get rich? So much money was being made that why would you stay? So suddenly, man's place in the universe, which was accepted, this is what you did because everyone did it before you, is now open to interpretation. Do I have the freedom to leave? If I have the freedom to leave, does that make me equal to the Lord? Because the Lord has the freedom to leave. And so you get concepts of independence, freedom, that we now have to debate, that we didn't debate before, and now we are. Meritocracies. What kind of government should we make in America that is 4,000 miles away? In 3 months, we're going to have to rule ourselves. It's too far to keep asking for permission. But if I can rule myself, does that mean I don't need a king? And if I could rule myself and I don't need a king, what kind of government should we have? What kind of rules should we have? Should we even have a king? So what the discovery of the New World, what the plunder of the New World, what the enslavement of the Africans and the creation of racism did was open everything in all of these cultures up to interpretation. After 1520, nothing is the same, even if things do look the same, because psychologically, philosophically, ethically, economically, politically, everything was open to question. Thank you. Good luck. Be safe. Because this is a tough lecture, and I'm sorry. Good luck.